So this was, on paper, what seemed to be one of Orbán's toughest electoral challenge. And yet, it's quite staggering that he actually increased his share of the vote. He actually got 2 extra seats. Undeniably, he is politically in tune with his country. I don't think you get 54% of the vote without some kind of understanding of what your country wants and what their desires are.
In numerous ways, Hungary and France could not be more different from one another. Hungary is a landlocked set of hills and plains in south-central Europe, flanked to the north and east by the Carpathian mountain range and to the west and south by the Drava River. It is a meagre remnant of its former self, having lost 2/3 of its territory in the Trianon Treaty upon losing the First World War. France is a hexagon almost 7 times the size, bathed by the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. The contrast is even starker in demography than in geography. France is a rapidly aging and growingly childless society, its replacement of successive generations increasingly assured by vast waves of immigration, primarily from South and Eastern Europe in the interwar period, and then from former colonies in the Maghreb and Subsaharan Africa after World War II. Hungarian nationhood, meanwhile, has often dovetailed with descending from the Magyar tribes that first settled in the former Roman province of Pannonia nearly a millennia ago. But for all of their substantial differences, the elections held in these 2 countries over the past 10 days have imparted similar lessons about the challenge of incumbency, the appeal of populism, the impact of international events, and the temptation to shoehorn complex events into readily baked cliché narratives. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán campaigned on his sound economic record and on keeping Hungary out of the Russo-Ukrainian war, and was re-elected to serve a 4th consecutive term, his Fidesz party gaining a 2/3 supermajority in parliament. Emmanuel Macron, meanwhile, seemed similarly fated for re-election on April 24th after securing a larger gap between his share of the vote and Marine Le Pen's than in the last first round 5 years ago. This week, we sit down with a regular US-based co-host, Julian Graham, to unpack the takeaways from these 2 races. As always, please rate and review on Common Decency on Apple Podcasts, and send us your comments or questions on Twitter at ondecencypod or over email at ondecencypod@gmail.com. And please, as always, consider supporting our show through Patreon at patreon.com/ondecencypod. Enjoy the show.
So thank you so much for everyone to come for this special Hungarian French election podcast. We are doing this from all over the world. Julian is joining us from Washington. Jorge just narrowly managed to make it after watching the very thrilling Champions League game between Chelsea and Real de Madrid. I think his heart is still pumping like crazy. And I'm in a stuffy hostel in Milan and trying to make sure the internet connection doesn't break. So this should be a great episode to all of you. Julian, let's begin with Hungary. What happened, basically? Can you give us kind of a broad picture, and then we'll progressively break it down as we go along?
So, good afternoon, good evening for everyone. Good morning if you're listening to this in the morning where you are. In Hungary, the main takeaway is that Viktor Orbán won his 4th term as Prime Minister. His party, Fidesz, obtained not just the majority, but the supermajority necessary to make amendments to the constitution, which the political opponents have alleged will lead him to erase what remains of Hungary's democracy in their words, whereas Fidesz supporters say that this will enable them to continue the policies they've implemented during Mr. Orbán's time in power and Fidesz's time in power, as they continue to look to reshape the country. There are many sort of major elements to this. The one that people are most aware of is probably Orbán's feuding with the European Commission in Brussels over a number of policies that Hungary has implemented over the years, including restrictions on immigration, reforms to the judiciary, curbs on media freedom, and policies affecting the rights of LGBT people. these are all areas where the European Commission and the Hungarian government disagree. And I think dropping today the news that the Commission would withhold some of the funding that was promised to Hungary because of these policies that the Commission does not support. This has been a long-running thing for Orbán, and he's used it to generate support for his party and his government from rural voters, whereas the urban elite in Budapest very much supported the opposition. In fact, the opposition parties won the biggest share of the vote in the capital, where Fidesz dominated everywhere else in the country. And then just the final thing I'll say, in this election, the opposition had united in a bid to try and oust Fidesz from power and to oust Orbán from power. They put aside their differences. They had a very convoluted primary process to put forward a unified candidate. And in the end, the result was a supermajority for Fidesz and cemented control for Orbán and his political party.
Yeah, and it's quite important because if you look at the past 16 years, Orbán has been charged for 12 of these years. He has been under immense pressure over his handling of relations with the EU. He was confronted, as you said, by a united opposition, which was trying to be more efficient in its share of the vote across the country and not be kind of beaten by a united Orbán side. So this was, on paper, what seemed to be one of Orbán's toughest electoral challenge. And yet, it's quite staggering that he actually increased his share of the vote. He actually got 2 extra seats. He seems unthinkable. Now, whether that is down to some kind of gerrymandering or some kind of pressure on the opposition or his control of the media, there's different kind of angles you can use to say it wasn't completely free and fair. But undeniably, he is politically in tune with his country. I don't think you get 54% of the vote without some kind of understanding of what your country wants and what their desires are.
And in the aftermath of the election, you actually saw members of the opposition crediting Fidesz and saying that they had misjudged the mood in the country, that they didn't fully understand the country, given the scale of the defeat that they had suffered. Heading into this, people thought it would be a close election, but Orbán and Fidesz's dominance quite very much shocked the opposition and many international observers. And people can put this down to the media or the way the political map is drawn, but even Hungarian politicians in the opposition were expressing a belief that they had misjudged the mood in the country and they didn't fully understand the country. And so on one level, Orbán's success, although his critics will always say that it's down to manipulation of the political system, at a very base level, he does have a fundamental understanding of Hungarian politics, of the Hungarian people, and that's very much demonstrated in the scale of his victory, despite the fact that the opposition had pulled out all the stops to defeat him in this election.
Just want to say, to be fair, on the flip side of that, they also picked a candidate who probably wasn't up to the task, who did a lot of blunders along the way, and that probably weakened their case.
Yeah, they probably shouldn't have done the open primary thing.
Yeah, and just for the record, Peter Markisai, the opposition's candidate in this race, lost in his own constituency. He failed to become an MP essentially and represent his constituency. And there's something else that's kind of up in the air whenever we're discussing this latest Hungarian election. I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but it seems like whenever the sort of the American and the British media narrative around this election has been that this has been a culture war election and that Orbán has essentially secured a supermajority for the kind of ethno-nationalism that these same media narratives have portrayed him as defending, right? Is the idea, and in a way this kind of reflects our own news cycle in the West, which we're sort of projecting out into Hungary. But the reality of the issues that Hungarian voters have actually voted on, I think, have been primarily the economy. Orbán has, put himself forth as the best economic manager for the country. He has put himself forth as someone who has secured the goods and ensured that Hungary grows at a fast clip. And then the other issue that was rather unexpected was the Ukrainian war. Orbán has also put his Fidesz party forth as the party that is going to keep Hungary out of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I think that has also been heavily underestimated by Western journalists. The idea that, the majority of Hungarians actually don't want to be entangled in a sort of Eastern European quagmire with which they, obviously, the whole story, I should perhaps just mention that there's an ethnic minority of Hungarians in Ukraine who Hungarian nationalists like Viktor Orbán claim that they're being mistreated by the ethnic Ukrainian majority. So these Hungarians in Hungary have even less sympathy for someone like Zelensky than they would otherwise have. But I just wanted to highlight this very important point, which I think was absolutely key in swinging the election for Orbán, which is that Orbán was campaigning out as someone who was going to remain, under whom Hungary is going to remain neutral.
Yeah, I want to go back to the rule of law breaches, because the EU launched its process to slash Hungary's funds over alleged rule of law breaches. So I looked a little into it, and obviously I'm no expert on this, and we probably will need to do a full episode on it. I was actually quite struck when I was reading some of the accusations on the media landscape that were leveled on Orbán. And I don't want to be too tongue-in-cheek about it, but it sometimes felt like he could have replaced the word Hungary with the word France. Essentially, it says there's an issue in Hungary, which is the issue of media concentration, media ownership concentration, which is, again, exactly the same thing in France, by a class of oligarchs who are very close to the government. Now, oligarchs may be too harsh a term, but there's a lot of tech millionaires of different business figures, former Inarch and whatever, who have essentially brought up all the media of the past 5 or 6 years, maybe last decade, and half of them are pretty much openly backing Macron, or at least they did so in 2017. So, it's obviously I'm a little tongue-in-cheek about it because there's probably some differences here and there. But it feels a lot of the accusations leveled against Orbán are things that probably could be leveled against Emmanuel Macron in France. So I think we have to be a little careful, because I think in those situations with Hungary, it's often hard to sort the wheat from the barley, so to speak, because there's sometimes things which are generally concerning, and sometimes it sounds like some sour grapes you're very annoyed that they can't win elections anymore. And I'm also struck that they're doing this procedure 2 days after the election. What kind of signal are you sending to Hungarians? We are punishing you for voting for the wrong candidates. I understand you probably would have wanted to open that procedure 3 days before the election. That probably would have been a lot worse. But 2 days after, it kind of feels like, screw you guys, you voted for the wrong guy, you're going to be punished. Now, maybe it's just a question of optics, but the optics matter here. The optics matter a lot, because it makes Hungarians feel like they're probably some kind of second-rate European citizens.
Yeah, and whenever we're discussing these proceedings against Hungary, but also Poland, both of which have been under severe scrutiny by the European Commission, the key difference here to highlight is that whereas in Poland there is a very clear case for, the reason for the Commission's proceedings against Poland is a lot clearer. Poland has reformed the way that Constitutional Court judges are nominated, and that reform has, in the minds of the opposition in Poland and bureaucrats in Brussels, that reform has jeopardized rule of law in Poland. That is the policy that is under scrutiny in Poland's case. In Hungary, there's a wide spectrum of policies that are the cause for this. There's the state of the media sector. There's the rules governing NGOs and to what extent NGOs can help in asylum. There's also the fact that there's been some allegedly some gerrymandering of the electoral districts in Hungary. Fidesz has been playing with the boundaries of those districts allegedly to sort of spread the votes out into as many constituencies as possible.
LGBT as well.
LGBT. So it's a very dispersed case. There are many policies currently being implemented in Hungary that have warranted these proceedings by the European Commission and the eventual paring back of funds.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Hungary is there's been a sort of growth, and you've had guests on who've talked about this in the past in your episode on Hungary's election, how Orbán and his model of conservatism is sometimes held up as an example for other sort of nationalist conservatives, or I'm trying to find like the right words because they use so many different ways to describe themselves. But I mean, in Orbán's exact words, he described it as Christian, democratic, conservative, patriotic politics. That model, which some conservatives in the UK, other conservatives across Europe, obviously we will get on to France, but also here in the United States in the Republican Party, they will probably sort of look at this campaign and see a validation of some of the broad-based criticisms and policy ideas and sort of political ideas that Orbán champions, the attacks on the elites, the idea of a sort of an enemy who's suppressing that national heritage and that cultural pride. I think this election, although, Hungary, in terms of its global influence, it doesn't quite compare to some of the other countries where we have these nationalist conservative movements, I do think that on an intellectual level, we will see some after effects of this, potentially in the way that certain campaigns around the world are run by other conservatives. And I am thinking a little bit about the US, where Orbán is held up as a model by some members of the Republican Party.
Absolutely. Let's pivot to the more recent election. We've been covering probably two of the most important elections in Europe over the past few months, the Hungarian election and the French election. Obviously, the French election is a bit closer to my heart, I guess, because I'm French and Jorge lives in Paris. So we've done many episodes on the French election, including a few episodes on Éric Zemmour. And there was a lot of interest for Éric Zemmour. Well, I'm happy or unhappy, depending on who you ask, to report that he has only managed to get 7% of the vote. The big winners of the election were, after all, unsurprisingly, we went back to the status quo, which we thought would have been potentially upsetted during the election. Macron is in first position, and Le Pen is in second position. And Jean-Luc Mélenchon once again does an incredible last-minute surge, but falls short, only a few 100,000 votes away. And then you get Pécresse and Zemmour, the two centre-right and right-wing candidates, very much far behind at 7% and 4.7%. And then you go down in like the low single digits with the Greens at 3%, the Communists at 3%. That's a good result for them. The Socialists are 2%, which is again a disastrous result for them, the worst result in their history. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of takes on the election, but the main take is after 5 years of tumultuous French politics, we end up pretty much exactly in the same situation as 2017, with Macron a bit stronger, Le Pen a bit stronger, despite all the tension she's been under. So yeah, it's a bit of a surprise here, actually. The surprise is that there wasn't a surprise in the end.
Yeah, it's strange that we spent so much time talking about, what the Zemmour candidacy could do for the French right, the dominance of the French right in French politics, and sort of the shifting of the sands of Macron's policy as he tries to court those voters. And in the end, we're sort of back where we were 5 years ago. albeit with a stronger showing from Mélenchon, who almost managed to get the snowball effect that I think you and Jorge had spoken of getting the parties on the left to sort of rally behind him just to try and sneak into that second round. But really, I guess the more things change, the more they stay the same.
And I want to talk about that because it's important. I think both on the right and on the left, you saw a very fluid situation in the past week. Because, again, in the first round, you choose. In the second round, you eliminated France. However, you can also kind of finesse it tactically. Because you may want to go for your preferred candidate on the left, on the right. But if that means your second alternative won't make it to the runoff, and you'll be forced to choose between the candidate you hate the most and the one you detest, but not quite as much as the other one, that's not a good situation. And that's exactly what happened. People on the centre-left who really don't like Mélenchon for different reasons kind of said, okay, I could probably live with Mélenchon as president, and I probably would be happy to have some kind of left-wing vote in a runoff. And so you saw voters from the Greens, voters from the Socialists, fleeing away from their first choice to back Mélenchon. And on the right, I think we saw a similar phenomenon, where a lot of people still saying, we have been so dominant in the past 5 years in the discourse, in politics, we could not allow this election to be taken away from us in a unexpected runoff between Macron and Mélenchon. And so, especially among Zemmour voters, you got a lot of tactical voting where people said, I can't risk seeing a Mélenchon against Macron runoff. Now, just one word on Mélenchon. Obviously, we talked about how there's a snowballing of tactical votes. I also think there's a bit more than that, because if you look at the total tally of the left in this election, in this first round, it's a lot higher than the total predicted for the left only 2 months ago. He has managed to mobilize voters outside of the traditional left-wing party bases. My understanding is he has managed to do extraordinary scores, especially in the banlieue, among the French youth, in electorates that tended to vote in kind of smaller numbers. And one thing he has managed to do, which has been a deliberate strategy over the past 3 or 5 years, has been to rekindle with the Muslim vote. Because the Muslim vote used to be a strong bulwark of left-wing support over the past 40 years. But they broke with the Socialist Party, not just because, of their reaction to the terrorist attacks in 2015, where some might have considered the response to be Islamophobic, where the François Hollande wanting to remove the citizenship of dual citizens for those suspected of terrorist acts and so on and so on. This context may have played a part, but I think more importantly, what played a part even before that was gay marriage. François Hollande passing gay marriage and also trying to liberalize education on homosexuality, on gender theory, and so on in schools. And both of these were reported to have massive effects among left-wing Muslim voters who felt they couldn't vote for these people again. And Mélenchon has managed to rekindle that flame. He had 69% of the Muslim vote in this election. 69%. That is huge. And more generally, I think actually it's interesting to see there's been a polarization of religious votes. I think Catholics have been increasingly voting for right-wing to far-right candidates, but we're still somewhat within the kind of what you'd expect. It's only like 40% who have voted for far-right parties, which is not so far from the general population, which voted at 35% for right-wing to far-right candidates. But for Jews, it's hard to actually measure where the Jews voted, for which candidates they voted. But I know in Israel, for example, Zemmour nearly gets 50%. Now, obviously, not all people living in Israel voting in the French election are Jewish, but it's a pretty good proxy here. It's an interesting situation. Very interesting situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, the Zemmour's success with the Jewish vote, which I think perhaps needs to be broken down a little bit. Zemmour was from the get-go the boogeyman of the established Jewish kind of legacy institutions like Le CRIF, and others, these established legacy Jewish institutions had called for Jews not to vote for any what they called extremist candidates, but particularly not to fall for Zemmour's bid to win the Jewish vote. And yet Zemmour did, I think, surprisingly well with French Jews. Obviously, we don't know quite just how well. I mean, the data is not broken down by ethnicity or by religious faith. But what we do know, as you said, is that the community of French Jews who have made the Aliyah to Israel, so French Jews voting from Israel, that tends to be a good proxy of where the Jewish vote is. And I think Zemmour won like 50% of the vote there, or maybe even a little bit higher. So Zemmour, and I think there was a specific case that I was looking into as well in the city of Sarcelles, which I think is in the Val d'Oise, so north of Paris. Sarcelles used to have a vibrant kind of working class Jewish community, and in the precincts where those Jews lived, Zemmour has also won. And was far ahead of Mélenchon, who elsewhere in the Val d'Oise, just like everywhere, kind of in the sort of beltway around Paris, has been very successful. But so Zemmour did very well with the Jews, and I think it has to do with this whole message about, you know, we're trying to avoid this sort of great replacement, and we're trying to halt mass migration, which is a threat to not just to Jews, but a threat to, in Zemmour's thinking, to France at large.
As long-time listeners of the show will know, Jorge is fascinating with all things Jewish. He's also single, so if you're a single woman of Jewish confession, Jorge would love to meet you. Jokes aside, one thing that's going to be interesting actually is Jewish voters who voted for Zemmour. They would not have voted for Le Pen because she's called Le Pen because of the history of the party. What's going to be interesting now is Zemmour called to vote for Le Pen. He backed Le Pen for the runoff. He's the only candidate I think who's done so far. And it's going to be interesting to see if that breaks a dam somewhat for the Le Pen vote in the Jewish community. Just another thing I want to add. You can have polls that will give you data on confessional data. It just cannot be public data. There's a distinction here. But usually they don't give data on the Jewish vote because it might not be big enough to be representative. Maybe something along those lines. But I know it's notoriously hard to understand who the Jews vote for. Julian, do you want to say something before you have to head out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd mention is now that we're heading back to a sort of rerun of Macron versus Le Pen, looking at the breakdown of the votes in the first round, regardless of who actually wins in the second round, and let's just assume for argument's sake that Macron does win in the second round, he's looking at a country governing a country where in the first round you could say for 52% of the electorate voted for non-mainstream candidates or non-established party candidates, by which I mean, you know, some people will say the far right or the far left, but let's just say non-mainstream candidates just to make it a bit easier. And attempting to govern, and some of the ambitious proposals, one of which he's already sort of walked back on, namely on the increasing of the retirement age. You know, winning an election is one thing, governing is another. And whether it's Macron or whether it's Le Pen, France is going to face a difficult 5 years if whoever is the prevailing candidate is unable to effectively govern because of widespread dissatisfaction, because either a plurality or even a majority of the electorate doesn't actually approve of their candidacy. I think that's a sort of macro level trend that is worth watching for the next couple of weeks. Is, you know, regardless of who wins, but what will be the approval of that person upon taking office? Macron's approval right now is sort of 44%, depending on which sort of poll you look at. That's going to be a big struggle for the next president, but also for France and indeed for Europe moving forward at such a difficult time for the country.
Yeah, I want to bounce back on what Julian just said. There's been a kind of hip theory that we were heading towards peak populism very soon. And we've been hearing this kind of argument since, I don't know, basically 2017, and it's refreshed every year. Obviously, Zemmour failed electorally big time. And Le Pen is still far behind Macron. But the share of far right keeps increasing year after year. She is getting more. She's getting millions of votes, and she's probably going to get. She's going to get 40 plus for sure. So she's going to be a lot higher than she was in 2017. And polls, which was already the highest record of the Front National back then, but now she could make it as close as 49%. I mean, I was talking to a friend who was at a Macron rally. And he was telling me, obviously, they were pretty happy and the results were quite good for Macron. They were a lot higher than what they thought it would be.
Yeah.
But they also it kind of dawned on them that they could come down in history as the people who screwed it, as the people who fucked up so much that the far right took power in France. Yeah. And I remember something Macron said in 2017, saying, I think French citizens should judge me on how strong the Front National will be in 5 years' time. And obviously, I don't think that's the way we should judge Macron's presidency. I think it's a stupid criteria. But if he is going to use that criteria, that's not a good look. That's really not a good look. And one illustration where a lot of Mélenchon voters are willing to abstain. Some of them actually will vote for Le Pen, despite Mélenchon saying many times during his post-defeat rally that not a single vote should go to Le Pen. A lot of people are just so fed up with Macron, they're willing to vote for Le Pen. I don't know.
And
Go ahead.
If I can just interject, this is you've just touched upon the what I think is going to be one of the most interesting trends to watch out for in the runoff, which is the Mélenchon to Le Pen vote. Who, if you know, as you said, as you very rightly pointed out, Mélenchon has massively grown his share of the general vote. He has come in third at what was it? Almost like 30%. And you know, and the interesting thing is, I mean, a lot of the people who have been voting for Marine Le Pen repeatedly over the past few elections in sort of the northern regions of the country were in turn older communist voters who had transitioned to the far right, but they still appreciated the kind of the welfare state element to the Rassemblement National's agenda, the fact that it was a very kind of social party, right? The fact that it was all for reindustrializing the country, the fact that it was for bringing jobs back, and I happen to be very interested in this transfusion of votes from the radical left to the radical right, and that has been going on in France for many years. So I don't think it's a stretch to imagine that many of the people, or at least a substantial share of the people who voted for Mélenchon in the first round, will be voting for Le Pen in the runoff. It makes coherent sense. I mean, it at the end of the day, I mean, the extremes kind of what's the saying? The extremes touch one another.
Converge, something like that. Yeah. A few comments. I think there's a lot in flux right now, and it seems to me like Le Pen is doing the better runoff campaign at the moment we are recording this. She quite astutely is attacking, I think, one of Macron's soft spots, which is his promise to reform the institutions. I think we talked many times on this podcast on Macron's very Jupiterian governance, which is very much in the spirit of the Fifth Republic. But at the same time, let us not forget, he was very much elected in a kind of new way of doing democracy in 2017. We need to be more, horizontal in our approach to politics. I think that was part of the appeal of Macron, saying we are going to transform the institutions which are a bit old and need freshening up. It's actually quite shocked to see that Le Pen in the past few days has attacked him on that angle. saying this it's not normal, for example, that the National Assembly is not representative of the electoral body at the moment. And so she's arguing for some kind of proportional vote, which would be tempered by some kind of boost to the biggest party, which obviously would favor her because she probably would not be able to win a normal legislative election. But a proportional election with a boost to whoever's in first position is obviously amazing for someone that's in that. But again, transforming institutions, she said we need more referendums. The Gilets jaunes were big on the popular initiated referendum, where if you reach a certain threshold of signatures, there would be a automatic referendum. Again, Macron has done nothing on that. He's promised many referendums over the past few years, and in the end has gone through with none of them. I think she's been quite astute because it's one angle which can unite a lot of the former Gilets jaunes, which speaks to the left, while not being something people on the right will be horrified by. It's, I don't know, so far, a bit like in 2017, where I thought Le Pen had the better start of for the runoff campaign. I think once again she got the edge. Let's not forget that then in the 2017 campaign, she completely collapsed in the debate against Macron, and that probably sank any of her hopes and nearly cost her a political career.
Yeah, and how? So obviously, one of the things that where one of the unsurprising aspects of this runoff campaign is that Le Pen has pitched herself as the sort of the anti-Macron option, right? She wants to rally as many elements of the electorate as possible in this sort of bid to oust Macron. And do you think, Francois, how successful do you think she will be with center-right voters who went for Pécresse in the runoff? Obviously, in the first round, obviously Pécresse has called for her voters to go for Macron, but do you think that enough of them will be tempted to vote for Le Pen to kind of change the outcome from what we saw in 2017?
So I think Macron's angle is quite simple. It's going to be Russia, Russia, Russia. And it's a very powerful angle. If it weren't for Russia, actually, I'd be quite worried for Macron because I think there's some good things that came out of his presidency. I think the employment market is probably looking a lot better than it was 5 years ago, despite COVID. But there is kind of lingering sense that Macron has promised everything to everyone and promised different things simultaneously. There's a meme that circulates about all Macron's pledges and all his quotes, which I think is quite funny on that matter. But it's the advantage of promising a lot of things to different people is that it works at least once, but then at some point it creates a sense that you're not exactly sure who you're voting for, and I think that's something that the French electorate has grown to resent. Macron is the only president of the Fifth Republic who was younger than the median citizen in France. All of them were older, and they also had longer political careers. People kind of knew them. With Macron, there's a sense they were seeing him build himself politically while he was president of the Republic. A lot of people joked he was doing his inner, finishing school for civil servants. He was doing his inner internship at the Élysée. That's obviously a bit of a harsh joke, but to some extent, he felt like he was building himself politically. And for example, take the issues of Islamic separatism, which ended up being so important in the second half of his term. He didn't have much of a backbone in this. He actually, if anything, he looked a lot more like a Tony Blair in 2017 on this kind of issues, trying to rub the nose of a right on the question of immigration. So I don't know, if it wasn't for Russia, I'd actually be a bit concerned because it's going to be really easy for Le Pen to kind of take different bits of his term and throw a few bones to the far left, throw a few bones to the right, and play defensively.
Yeah, and obviously, I think it was Le Monde was reporting on yesterday was reporting on Macron's pitch to the left. He's also been I think one of the things he has done since the first round is he has, or maybe this was in the days leading up to the first round, but he is now proposing to put his proposed reform to the retirement system to a vote, to a referendum. And so he's trying to build this sort of almost real socialist kind of angle to his message, so that in the hope of tapping into Anne Hidalgo's and Jean-Luc Mélenchon's vote from the first round. And no, I think it will be an interesting run up. I think you're certainly going to have many of the same kind of lines of attack raining down on Marine Le Pen. I mean, Macron and everyone who is going to be backing him is essentially going to be portraying Marine Le Pen as someone who will lead us to Frexit, someone who, even though she is not pledging to get us out of the European Union, the result of her policies will be that eventually France will have to leave, or else the EU will just kind of crumble. So I think to that extent we are seeing a redux of 2017. To that extent, we are very much seeing a redo of the election 5 years ago. But as you said, I think the Russia angle is gonna be very relevant too.
Two things to probably wrap this up. One is the presidential election is going to be followed up by the legislative election. We're going to be electing our new Assemblée Nationale, our new lower house. It's obviously very hard to predict, but if we are using the data from the first round of the current presidential election, it would translate in 256 La République En Marche MPs, 206 Rassemblement National MPs, and 104 La France Insoumise MPs. Now, obviously, there's so many factors going on here that's going to screw up the scenario. Obviously, there's going to be the incumbents factor. There's going to be different alliances. There's obviously going to be more than just three parties in parliament. So this is obviously a gross overgeneralization. But it also means that the situation is quite open, actually, for the legislative election. Now, that said, and I'm touching a little bit about it here, but I should have an article published on Thursday with Unheard on this question. The French are republican monarchs, essentially. Sorry, we live in a republican monarchy where we decide every 5 years to elect a king. We usually decide to decapitate him 5 years later. But we are definitely very monarchist in our approach to institutions. The president of France is hugely powerful. Once the presidential ship has sailed, it is very hard for the oppositions to actually steer public policy. What that means is the only election that matters in France, if we are being serious, is the presidential election. The legislative election could matter because if he doesn't have a majority, the president can't do much. But what has always happened is when the legislative election just follows the presidential election, the French electorate always gives the new president, the incoming president, a majority that is more than enough to play with. Because, they feel it wouldn't make sense to elect a president and then not to give him a majority in parliament. So, again, in 2017, people said Macron, even if he wins the presidential election, he has no chance of getting a parliamentary majority. In the end, he had one of the largest parliamentary majority in the history of the Fifth Republic. The joke was you could have slapped a Macron sticker on the face of a goat, and he probably would have been elected in some areas of France, given the kind of overwhelming success he had in this legislative election. The opposition were deflated; they lost hope, and people wanted to give Macron a mandate to govern. But what it also means is, I think this election was quite lackluster. It actually, at times, didn't feel like there was an election. I was actually walking around in Paris on Sunday night, and there wasn't much that would bring me back to the idea we just went through the most important democratic moment in the French Republic. Not much. And obviously, there was COVID, there was Russia and Ukraine, which kind of took our attention away from it. But also, I think the campaign was quite poor. Macron basically refused to campaign. He only started campaigning 10 days before the election, which just staggers me. And it's an issue because it means the French electorate is going to be choosing on not much to base their opinion on. But I think it's a larger issue because it's supposed to be a cathartic moment. If you only have an important democratic moment every 5 years, and some people might argue that's an issue, but if you only have every 5 years, it means it needs to be an important moment. It needs to be a moment where all the issues are on the table, where there's a proper democratic catharsis.
Yeah.
And I already thought in 2017 the election was quite poor because we talked about all the scandals from François Fillon and ended up actually talking very little about Islamic separatism, which probably should have been an issue given the terrorist attacks of the past 5 years. But we barely talked about it. And obviously that ended up being one of the most important issues Macron had to deal with. We talked about the environment, but in general terms, we didn't talk about the details of how we would pay for that kind of transition. And in the end, we got the Gilets jaunes, which I think was also somewhat the consequences of a lack of democratic catharsis in 2017. I'll go more in detail in the article if you're interested, which should be released tomorrow for all of you. But I'm actually quite worried. I'm actually quite worried that this election did not deliver what it should have delivered. And whoever's elected the next president is probably going to have to pay for the lack of a proper democratic encounter in 2022.
Yeah, and let's remind folks, obviously, that one of the one of the things we learned as the result from the first round was being counted is that Zemmour, even though despite his poor showing, he is going to be running in the legislative election under the Reconquête ticket. So this is going to be an even more fractured political landscape than it was in 2017. And the chances, I take your point that the tendency has been for the French electorate to appoint a powerful monarch, and in this case, this will point towards the French electorate voting a big majority of La République En Marche MPs into the new National Assembly, but there is going to be a very large, admittedly an even larger delegation of Rassemblement National MPs, and obviously the new Reconquête MPs. I mean, I don't think that Zemmour is done with French politics at all. I mean, we're going to keep hearing about it. I think he's one of the things he's trying to do to kind of spin his defeat is to say that, look, I have been defeated because the people weren't ready for me, and I have been able to set the agenda for this electoral race. A lot of the issues that all candidates have had to weigh in on, I was the first one to bring them up. This has kind of been Zemmour's pitch since losing badly in the first round.
On that, I think Zemmour's campaign is obviously an electoral failure, but there's probably much to be said on how he kind of smashed the overturned window. Obviously, if you're being very, how can I say, serious about the concept of overturned window, you have to say politicians technically can't open the overturned window. It can only be kind of intellectuals outside of the political sphere. But undeniably, Zemmour and the kind of hybrid intellectual politician role he's had over the past few months has smashed the overturned window. I mean, the fact that concepts like the Great Replacement and the concept of remigration, which, to be honest, were far-right memes a year ago, are now kind of polling over 60%, is just, I don't know, just mind-boggling. Another question is going to be obviously the landscape post-election, because I was talking to a few people in the kind of Zemmour, Le Pen battle sphere, I guess, and the Zemmour people are very worried. They're worried they're going to be completely vampirized by Le Pen, and Le Pen is really going to punish them hard because a lot of them are former Rassemblement National people who betrayed her. Zemmour thought he would have been able to recreate a kind of large tent right-wing party. It's hard to imagine that now, given his failure. and it remains to be seen what his place will be in the future. He still wants to be in politics. He probably can't go back to media now. It's hard to go back after you've done that transition. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting thread to follow the past few months, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Again, thanks a lot, Julian. Thanks a lot, Jorge. Thanks a lot for tuning in.
Thank you.
Two things before we leave. First of all, we are very much saddened to hear that Jesse Morton has passed away. Jesse Morton was one of our guests for our episode 24 with Hugo Micheron. It's actually Hugo who's texted us today saying that unfortunately Jesse passed away a few weeks ago. We're very much saddened by this loss. I really recommend all of you to listen to our episode with him, because he has an incredible life story. He started as a poor redneck in America, and ended up joining a Islamist cell and being a recruiter for Al Qaeda, and then having a road to Damascus moment, I guess, and ever since has been trying to fight against Islamic terrorism. And unfortunately, he passed away. So obviously, very saddened to hear that. Really recommend it. It is a fascinating episode, and I think that's probably the best thing you can do to pay homage to him at the moment. So, and on that note, if you want to support the show, if you've liked this episode, and if you liked our other episodes, we would love to see you on our Patreon. Patreon allows us to do some great things. Again, we are exploring with the concept of a Uncommon Decency book club, but we need to sense some, how can I say this, some appetite for it. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of extra work for us without much need for. And we are doing this on our spare time. We are not being paid for this, so there's only so much time we can spend on this podcast. So anyways, we'd very much appreciate your support on Patreon. If you can't afford the Patreon, please, you can do us a world of good by rating the show on Apple Podcasts or subscribing on Spotify, for example, or even more a simple share to your friend would do all of us a load of good. So yeah, thanks Jorge, thanks Julian, and to all of you, I say see you next week.
Thank you, Francois.